My guest today is Mark Regnerus of the University of Texas at Austin's Sociology Department and co-author of the book Premarital Sex in America, How Young Americans Meet, Mate, and Think About Marrying. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Shirley. It's good to be here.
It was a surprising statistic to see that 90% of Americans are having premarital sex.
Yeah, and apparently that's not new news either. It's even from earlier cohorts, it sounds like 90 could even be an underestimate, and it might be as high as 95%.
So you found all this out by using a lot of surveys,
right,
and some interviews.
Right. We drew upon the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, it's now in its fourth wave. We used its third wave data, which was in the young 20s. The National Study for Family Growth, the National Study of Youth and Religion, and then which also had interview data, and then I did another 40 or so on the UT campus.
Interviewed your own students?
Right.
Okay. Now, this 95% of Americans having sex before marriage, that feels as if there has to be some people that are not having sex before marriage. And what are the variables that make a difference?
Right. Among that 5%, and then even among those that have had sex before marriage, a lot of them have sort of only had sex with their husband or wife. There's three things that really characterize virgins. It's religiousness. The more religious among them, less likely to have had premarital sex. People with limited attraction, and that's primarily true of men rather than women, for reasons we can talk about later. And the third category is sort of the more strategic or planful people tend to wait longer, and some of them wait until marriage.
So if we took a look at any of those three characteristics, and let's talk a little bit about the religious characteristic. Do groups that surround religious young adults help or hinder this conversation?
Oh, man, they can do both pretty effectively. I talk both in this book and in Forbidden Fruit, my earlier book, about what sociologists call plausibility structures, sort of networks or groups of people who make ideas plausible and keep ideas plausible. And so when we're talking about the realm of sexual behavior, to wait till you're married to have sex, you've got, that's an idea that doesn't get a lot of support today.
For instance, in movies or
Sure.
TV or songs, anything.
Right.
The culture is not saying wait.
No, right. So, and it's not enough for your parents just to say wait, too. There has to be multiple messages and sort of social support for not doing what you certainly feel like doing. So, religious groups can help. They can also hurt by, being trite about it or overly punitive about it. But they can also help by being realistic. I think the first thing they need to do is to deal with young people where they're at, and not to sort of set the bar unbelievably high and punish them if they don't get it. I mean, that used to be the case, I think, in a lot of Christian congregations.
And you talk a little bit about the red state, blue state, using the terms red and blue because that's
right.
become part of our vocabulary Sure. now in the United States. And you say, you made quite a outstanding claim that said blue or liberal young people are not interested in getting married at all. Is that
That's not true. No,
okay.
That's not true. They're interested in, I said red and blue, it wasn't so much states, but red and blue.
Ideologies.
Right. They tend to want the same things long term, but on a very different timetable. So blues wish to marry as well. They tend not to have problems with ideas like gay marriage and things like that. But marriage is something for blues that can wait and should wait until at least into your upper 20s, maybe your 30s. So it's not an idea that resonates during the early adult years.
And there's no guilt about having sex outside of marriage?
Generally not, although I think there are strong gender differences regardless.
Right.
So it's not like blue women never feel guilt over sex. I think they can. But generally speaking, they would see that as an anomaly. Cohabitation is fine. with blues. It's just, for reds, they may cohabit as well, but it has to sort of serve marriage. It has to be on the way to something more traditional.
So a more conservative, as we have traditionally understood it, a more
Right.
conservative ideology around that.
Right. Reds, I think reds and blues act up and act out sexually like each other, but it tends to be in different ways and at different times. The reds, by the time you turn 20, you need to be starting to grow up. And the blues, just 20, they're just getting started, usually.
Okay.
This is why you see reds sort of lose their virginity at earlier ages than blues, on average, even though reds imbue virginity and sex with sort of a seriousness that blues do not.
I think that's why it was somewhat hard to believe the high number, this 90 to 95% of Americans, when we hear so much about groups of people that talk about abstinence and virginity pledges, but they, from your research, don't seem to be making a difference.
Pledges can make a difference. They tend to, certainly people who pledge are more likely to stay virgin till marriage.
Is this because they're
Sure.
more planned or more risk averse?
I think it's a combination of those things. Some of the pledging business tends not to work, in part because the pledges happen like when you're early teenagers, right? I mean, some of them aren't even thinking sexual thoughts until later in the teenage years. And if it's just a one-time thing, if there's no social support for it 5 to 8 years later, it's almost ineffective. But they're not completely ineffective.
So you have some myths that you've debunked by your research. And one of your myths is that everybody else is having more sex than I am.
Right, that's a common one. It's been common for a long time.
Right.
And it can lead to sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and people can have relationships that they regret because they thought they should, not so much because they really wanted them. Men and women both tend to overestimate how much sex is going on around them. I think it's particularly true on college campuses, which tend to ooze sexuality. The data suggests that there's less sex going on and people having fewer partners than you tend to think, right? And partly that's true because we look at campus elites, I call them, right? They're the face of campus, right? They're the most handsome men, the most attractive women. And sure, popularity and attractiveness tend to spell more access to sex. But that's not sort of the typical college student. So I think we tend to overestimate how much sex goes on campus. Certainly more goes on among people who didn't go to college.
You talk about the scripts that people have.
Mm-hmm.
And the scripts that you have are part of that support for these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us a little bit about what scripts young people are hearing today.
Right. I mean, I use the idea of a script, not just in this book, but in my sociology classes. Sort of, this guides how we live life in lots of different ways.
It's the stories people hear and believe.
And we want to know what we're supposed to do. And so in this domain, certainly, there's a lot of sort of following a script. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So tends to be a lot of, within popular scripts today, sort of quick to sex, right? And it's unspoken. These scripts are not spoken. It's, how do I know how long I'm supposed to wait before I have sex with my boyfriend, some women would think. And he's not saying, he didn't give you a timetable.
Right, you don't lay it out.
But they're trying to figure this out, right?
Right?
And so sometimes, this is why women talk about sex more than men do, right? Not that they want it more, they tend to want it less. But it's because the men's demand side is fairly stable. Women have to figure out what they're going to do, right? So women talk more about this. Talking is sort of figuring out what the scripts are. What are they doing? What should I do? And so then in their interaction with their boyfriend, it's often unspoken, right? Sometimes they wait long enough where he has to sort of say, well, what's wrong with you, right? Because in his mind, he has this idea about what's too long or what's the appropriate length of time I should wait. But they're generally ready earlier than women. And so women have to lean on these scripts more about sort of, well, how long can this last? How long do I have to do this in order to keep the relationship going?
And that's one of the myths is I have to have sex. If I'm female, I have to have sex in order
Right.
to help a fledgling relationship
Right.
along, or
Yeah, it's
or bolster one that feels a little shaky.
Right, right. I mean, in the short run, it might feel like you've done the relationship a favor, right? But in the long run, she bargains away her best tool, probably, right? And she gives away this sort of this thing of great value to the relationship and to him. And when you commence having sex, it sort of puts him in the driver's seat. She was in the driver's seat. And I'm not trying to put necessarily a religious spin on this. It's somewhat a simple function of power within a relationship. Now that you've opened the gate, he should have access to this, right?
You don't stop once you've started this
Very
dynamic
seldom,
in the
very
relationship.
seldom. I found that in Forbidden Fruit as well. It's like the number of people who are what we call one-timers. They've had sex once and then said, no, this is not for me. I'll do that again some other day. Very unlikely.
And your research also showed that you can actually change the scripts that young people are living by parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles actually speaking into those scripts and giving a different permission or norm.
Right. I don't talk about whether that's going to happen or not. I'm not optimistic. But it certainly is true that parents have a lot more sway over their young adult children than they tend to think they do. And certainly other organizations and institutions that are part of have. But if you think about the battle between institutional messages, the conservative messages about sex are not that many. And there are far more message sources than there used to be, right? I mean, the media sources are coming out our ears.
Now, when you talk about women being the gatekeepers to the sexual nature of a relationship, a lot of women don't feel like they're the gatekeepers at all.
No.
And is this because the script doesn't support that you're the gatekeeper?
Right, because they don't set the price of sex by themselves.
And this
right?
is where
they
you
used to. Okay, they used to.
Yeah, let's talk about the price of sex, because
Sure,
we're
right.
not talking about prostitution here. We're talking about the
No, but
dynamic
it's all,
of men and women.
It's all on the spectrum, frankly. Prostitutes are unique because they get paid money to have sex. All relationships still, though, do have sort of a feel of sort of, I'm giving you this in return for that, right?
So resources are exchanged.
Yeah, right. And less resources are exchanged from him now than 20, 30, 40 years ago, in part because she doesn't need those resources like she once did, okay? So some of this is a function of, well, women's position in society has advanced considerably. She's no longer dependent on a man for livelihood, right? So what he can offer in return for what he wants, which is sex, is not nearly as significant to her as it once was. So there's some social changes we've seen in the last 30 years that have some unintended consequences in the domain of relationships.
So why
that being
should
one of them.
So why should a woman hold out, in essence, if she doesn't need the protection or the wealth?
If she doesn't want to hold out, she doesn't have to, right? If she does want to hold out, it's more difficult to, because she doesn't get social support for that from her fellow women peers. I talk in other places about the cartel among women, right? It used to be more of a cartel among women, which is why...
banding together.
Yeah, so not even consciously, but this is how you could label certain women with certain words, right? And stain their reputations, because they were a threat to the cartel of women.
The price of sex, basically.
Yeah,
right. They were driving down the price.
Enough women in the community who were willing to have sex without commitment, well, they would draw attention of men that otherwise the cartel was going to get, right? So there's been a lot of significant social change that has altered the price of sex, which is probably at a historic low, frankly.
But I have to say, the way in which men are described here is usually always wanting sex.
Sure. It's a little bit monolithic.
Right. It was a little dismissive of the kind of complexity that I've experienced with the kind of men that I know, that this isn't, they are respectful of women. They are looking to see whether or not this relationship is working for both people. So So were you just describing what is like the underlying hidden agenda that is
Yeah, it's not
fancied
so much
up, or
right. It's always there, right? And plenty of men still wish to have a romantic relationship of that's intellectual, that's emotional, etc. But underneath that is sort of the frank reality that if she came on to me and wanted to have sex, I probably wouldn't say no, right? That just is an underlying truth about men and women, generally speaking.
Your book really does make a case that men and women are wired differently around this idea of when and how often to have sex.
Right. All the data seem to point in that direction. I'm not reinventing the wheel in that domain.
Some of the data you also found was that the more partners women have, the poorer their emotional health.
Right.
I think that with some of the movement in what's generally known as the women's liberation movement or feminist movement, would sort of hesitate about that. It would push back against that.
Sure, they can push back all they want. The data still suggests that the more partners you have, the less happy you generally are.
If you're female.
More depressive symptoms. Yeah, only for women. It doesn't work that way for men. Men, there's very little that seems to alter that. Men at the top end of the number of sexual partners they've had do seem to not be functioning emotionally as well as other men. That doesn't surprise me.
Because there may be some other things going on.
Right.
Sometimes we talk about strings being attached. And in your research, it seems that women actually want some of the strings attached.
Yeah, that's no strings attached. Is this? It's even become an acronym, NSA. Men prefer it more than women. Some women say they want it, and I believe that some women are fine with it. It's just they're a minority.
According to your research.
And sex for most women just doesn't work as well with no strings attached. Now, I can think of examples, including students that I've interviewed, for whom they tried to make it work, right? But what I also see a lot of is women sort of longing for their first sexual partner. They've gone off and are in relationships with other people, and yet they're still thinking about that guy, right?
So this American narrative of I have to find my soulmate. So I'm on this quest and I might meet up with a number of different people to find my soulmate. I might have sex with them. Is this a narrative that is actually healthy and realistic, or is having a good partnership part of a better narrative?
I'm no fan of soulmate marriage talk. That implies that there's one person out there and it's just a function of time and effort until I find that person. And a lot of that sort of also, there's sexual chemistry comes into play, like, oh, I should have sexual chemistry with my soulmate. And some sexual chemistry is believed to be something that just sort of occurs magically, right? Rather than like being worked on, right? Sex is a learned behavior. Chemistry is generally learned behavior, right? But if you have a extensive sexual past, you know what you like and what you don't like, and if this person for whom you're now in a sexual relationship doesn't do what you like, then the chemistry must not be there, right? That's strictly a function of having had extensive sexual experience, right? The learning process got worked out earlier.
Well, there's something to falling in love with someone you admire and respect, and that they have been a good partner with you, that you've done some substantial things together, you have common values. And actually, when you're in relationship with those people, you can find that a chemistry actually occurs.
One of the interviewees that comes to mind when you said that is someone who, she's had several sexual relationships that have not worked out. She has this one friend who she says she's not attracted to, in part because I think she sort of sequestered him as like, I don't want to soil him with my stuff, right? I don't want to ruin this thing that we've got going on. And I tend to think, this is the person who you're meant for, right? Somebody who you're attracted to, who you like talking to. But there becomes this fear around ruining good relationships. Don't waste sex on a good relationship.
And that's because they become so serial, they they stop and start.
And in her case, I asked her, "Are you on the pill?" She said, "Yeah, of course." And I said, "Well, try getting off the pill, because the pill can actually hormonally alter your impressions of men." She said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah. I mean, it acts in that manner." I tend to recommend to both women and men, don't fall in love while somebody's on the pill, right? Because that can hormonally mask sentiment that is there.
But that feels like pretty dangerous advice, especially for the sexually active group that you're talking with.
I asked her to do that, and she said, "I'm going to do that." 3 weeks later, I talked to her, and I said, "Did you do that?" And she said, "No, my mother wouldn't let me."
Well, if your advice was go off the pill and cease having sexual relations, that might have been a little bit.
The thing is, too, is also sort of, it would have functioned in the way of, it would also have raised the price of sex for her.
Yes, right.
Which is not a bad thing to do.
No.
Okay?
You were trying to give her more options, to think
Right.
about this in a more complex way.
I wanted her to sort of see this fellow in a different light, potentially, and see what she really felt for him. She could always go back on a pill later, but there is no social support for that, even within her own family.
We talk about late marriages and this idea that I have to get everything right. I have to have my education done. I might want to have some money in the bank. I might want to have some debt paid off. And so when I'm really ready, really formed, then I'll get into these marriage relationships, because I think people actually don't want to get divorced. And so they're trying to maximize all the criteria before they jump in.
Right.
But this is going to be a difficulty if you want to wait for sex.
Yeah, those two don't compute, right?
Right.
Waiting till you're 28 or 30, and waving goodbye to probably the 10 most sexualized years of your life. That's just not going to happen, right? So I've written elsewhere a little bit about the benefits of marrying young, meaning between like 20 and 25. Simply as sort of pushback against this norm that you really have to have it all together. You have to find out who you are. You want to be in a position where you won't be changing. I haven't hit that one yet, right?
Everybody's changing all the time.
Right. And you change with another person, right? And you hold this relationship, this union, as sort of sacred and set apart, and that will not change, right? But a lot of people think that waiting till 30 or 35 is shrewd and intelligent. And for some people, it totally is, right? They're not ready emotionally when they're 25, or they're not ready to commit, etc. But it does some women a disservice, right? I mean, if you're asking women to wait as well, they're moving through fertility years. They only want 2 children. It's not that big of a deal. But fertility is more difficult after having a baby after 30, certainly after 35, than it was in the entire decade of the 20s.
So your research actually supports, at least for women, getting married between 20 and 25. And probably for men, too, you think that it's helpful. And this isn't out of some particular philosophy. You're just saying the data would say that this is a good decision, and that all of sort of the pushback around that isn't maybe as tested.
The data it favors somewhere between, say, 20, 21, certainly for women, through the late 20s. What I pushed back was that there's a lot of assumptions that getting married when you're 20, 21, 22 is just categorically a bad idea. The data just don't say that, right?
Doesn't say it, does it?
18, 19, yes, bad idea, especially if you're a man. Data supports sort of at least a 2 to 3 year age gap.
But this idea of marriage being formative,
Right.
so that you can grow together,
Right.
is something that you think that the data actually supports, that you
Right.
don't have to merge
Right.
2 people, that perhaps you could form together.
Yeah, one of my economist friends calls it endogenous match quality.
Oh my.
Yeah, it's where you make a match work. You create a match as you move forward through marriage, rather than sort of saying, I have to have exogenous, something outside of the union has to fit before we enter it, okay? So there's a lot of evidence that suggests that if you can create a match within marriage, then you're in good shape. If you expect the match to exist independently of two people, that's tough.
Right.
Yeah, it's sort of symptomatic of our fast-paced world that we want relationships to work out quickly. There's speed dating. They're sitting at a table for 5 minutes to figure out if you've got something with this person. That's ludicrous, really. Relationships take work. Friendships, marriage take work, and it pays benefits over time.
Right. Well, my guest today has been Regnerus, sociology professor and author of the book, Premarital Sex in America, How Young Americans Meet, Mate, and Think About Marrying. I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.